And maybe with the exception of the panelists, I'm going to ask that everyone mute their mics if not done so already, so we can just drown out any background noise that may creep up. First, I would like to welcome everyone. My name is Calvin Townsend. I'm an attorney here at the law firm Ice Miller LLP. I've been here for about a little over a year in the litigation department. And I must say again, I'm honored to be here today serving as a moderator before our very esteemed panelists here today. I would like to thank the Chicago Lawyers Committee, Working Families, United for Equity, Action Center, and Ice Miller as well for the opportunity to serve as your moderator here today. Today you guys are in for a treat to hear and learn from our panelists here today. This is an important conversation based on what this country has seen and quite frankly, what this country has been through. Most recently with the killing of George Floyd and currently with the trial of Derek Chauvin that's in progress as we speak. So how this is set up today, we'll talk about certain topics. And I'll be sure to leave time at the end for any questions that you may have of our panelists here today. Feel free to send your questions in the chat room to me. I'll be able to, I will monitor them and make sure I leave enough time to get to each question at the end. So without further ado, I would like to give the panelists the opportunity to introduce themselves, their organizations, and roles within their organizations. And also when the panelists introduce yourselves, if you can also give your pronouns as well that you go by. And first up, Alyx Goodwin.
Thank you. Hey y'all, my name is Alyx Goodwin. I use she and her pronouns. I'm a senior organizer at Action Center on Race and the Economy, or ACRE, and I'm also a member and organizer with BYP 100 and the Defund CPD campaign.
Thank you, Alyx. Next, we have David Melton.
Thanks, Calvin. My name is David Melton, he, him pronouns. I'm a semi-retired attorney and co-chair of the Chicago Council of Lawyers and Chicago Appleseed Civil Liberties Committee, working on police oversight issues, among others.
Next, we have Adam Slade. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it.
No, you got it right, Calvin. Thank you.
Okay, perfect.
Hello, everyone. I'm Adam Slade. He, his pronouns. I am a senior fellow for Chicago United for Equity, working this year on the People's Budget Project. I am also an independent government consultant working with different government organizations in the Northeast Illinois region. And I am a full-time PhD student at UIC in the Department of Public Administration. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Adam. Next, we have Akele Parnell.
Hey everyone, my name is Keeley Parnell. I'm an attorney.
Sorry,
no worries, he, him pronouns. I'm an attorney with Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and we are a civil rights organization, attorneys and advocates working for racial equity and economic opportunity for all. We've been supporting some of the work with the People's Budget Team, Rematch Chicago, around divest and reinvesting in communities that have been harmed by the war on drugs. And so yeah, happy to be here today. Thanks.
Next, we have Kennedy.
Hey everyone, my name is Kennedy Bartley, she, her pronouns. I'm the legislative director of United Working Families, and I'm also on the steering committee of the Defund CPD campaign.
Thank you, Kennedy. Next, we have, and again, I apologize, Timna.
Hey there, I'm actually not a panelist, but I do work with Chicago Lawyers Committee, and I'm so excited for this panel.
Thank you. Lastly, we have Anil.
Yeah, I don't think he's not going to be a panelist either. He just-
Okay, all right.
Yeah, thanks anyway, Calvin.
You're on mute.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Perfect. What I'd like to do is open up the floor to the panelists. I'd like to start by first asking, how did we get here? How did police unions become so powerful?
So I'll
Yeah.
be happy to kick it off. In my view, police unions and police contracts became an impediment, and police unions became so powerful because the vast bulk of the public was not paying attention, and the city administrations that were supposed to be paying attention and providing oversight were much more focused on economic issues and allowed police unions to put a lot of bad policy provisions into the contracts over the years because of the focus on the economic issues rather than the policy issues.
And then to add to that, I think a lot of police unions' power is also rooted in our society or our country's commitment to the war on drugs over the past 30, 40 years, and the investment in of millions and millions of dollars, probably billions of dollars into the war on drugs. And I think a lot of fear mongering around how, in the post-civil rights era in particular, leading up through the 70s and 80s, perhaps a lot of fear mongering around how are we going to control, to be honest, Black and brown communities, and perceived violence and criminality in Black and brown communities. And I think that that's sort of initially at the root of it, and then that was solidified, and cities sort of negotiated away their power and their bargaining power with police unions, and that became embedded in these police union contracts and different laws that we'll get into in our talk today. But I think initially it's sort of the power imbalance is rooted in the war on drugs.
Thank you. And just kind of even just a spin-off of that question, what do you believe, outside of what has already been mentioned, what do you believe are some of the driving forces within these police unions and their power? Is it more their ability when it comes to monies to be heavily funded, their ability to donate to certain politicians' campaigns? What are some of the things that are in place that you believe drives their power?
I'm down to go like really big on this, taking a first stab at this. And I think to speaking to some of the things that Akele was just sharing, I think, overall, like there's just this systemic support of police. Like our societies are like indoctrinated to believe that police are the answer and need the backup and need the support. Police have had police and policing as an act, right, has had just very strong narrative intervention over time that has socialized us and reinforces that that they need the power, that they need the funding, they need the resources, the militarized equipment, and all of these things to do their jobs effectively, despite data and research showing that's just not true.
I think another factor is from a political standpoint, police sometimes in dealing with politicians have an implicit threat of ceasing to do their jobs and allowing politicians to become the object of a lot of questions about public safety issues and problems growing, and that gives them some power over politicians as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with David. To add to that, I think our segregated neighborhoods in Chicago also have a significant impact in the political realm, where wealthier communities tend to vote more consistently and for a greater police presence due to their experiencing of policing versus other neighborhoods with an alternative experience in police protection. And so at the end of the day, the police department seems to be a very safe constituency for politicians to support, and pushing back on some of the workers' rights protections or procedures to protect individual police officer rights raised to the forefront and are supported in the wake of some financial concessions in the contract renegotiation process. And so it becomes a tug of war between, do you support the police or not? A misnomer either or kind of choice. And in our political environment, that's traditionally been, you support the police unequivocally. I think in recent years, that's definitely changed, and rethinking what policing means in our city is top of mind of most of our residents.
Yeah, and if I can just hop in before we close out on this question, I think that this may be a Chicago-centric answer, but I think Chicago serves as a good case study for these questions, since we do have the most police per capita. And I think that when we think about the socio-political orders of neoliberalism and austerity, and we recognize that that is a trend across cities and the administrations across cities, once we start breaking those things down, it becomes very clear the role in policing and maintaining a lot of the administrative powers of the folks who occupy these offices. When we talk about the political component of it, the city of Chicago has been under neoliberal rule for since the Dailies, with an exception of Mayor Washington's tenure. And time after time, we're kind of operating under these austerity budgets. And so I don't know that I need to break down neoliberalism and austerity now, but recognizing policing as a tool to maintain those orders, I think that the powers that be are constantly in a state of reifying the utility and necessity of policing.
Thank you everyone for those answers. So then that leads to our next topic. When we talk about defund efforts, what does defund mean? And even more importantly, what does that look like?
I don't want to Kennedy, I think you're in the best position to perhaps answer that.
Sure, yeah. So what does defund mean? I think that when I talk about defunding the police, and when folks stop there, I'm finish that sentence, right? Because no one's talking about this politic as just simply the absence of policing. It's about defund the police to refund our communities, and it's about making clear distinctions between police and public safety, or policing and public safety. And so when we're talking about defund the police, whether it be coming from an abolitionist politic or not, it's a campaign, it's a movement towards bringing about, again, the things that we know bring our communities public safety. So defund the police to fund public mental health services, defund the police to fund equitable, affordable, quality housing, defund the police to ensure that our education system is equitable, defund the police to do these things that we know keep communities safe. And Alyx is probably well suited to hop in here as well. But yeah, as an abolitionist, when I say defund the police, it is through an abolitionist lens. But again, I'm thinking about abolition more as presence than absence. So thinking about the life affirming things that we need to build up as we tear down the things that are taking our lives. So yeah.
I would just add, that was great, Ken. I think the thing that I would add here, is also the demand to defund is also an anti-capitalist demand. What Kennedy was speaking to before, the relationship between policing and upholding the status quo, whether that be for wealthy politicians or for just corporate America and Wall Street. I think that it's really important that we understand how all of these things are connected. And when we're talking about defund, there's a reason that defund also includes cops out of schools, cops out of CPS. It's not just cops within the CPD that are focused on like within the Chicago Police Department, but policing as an act and as an institution. Yeah.
I'll add on to that. I agree 100% with both of those views. I also think some folks literally do mean eliminate the police department, and they are operating from a position of trauma where they see the police as a existential threat to themselves and to their communities. So there are many flavors of defund, if you will. But also I think a lot of folks that have worked on these issues for years and decades have tried the reform route and have seen reforms pass and progress made, then to be ignored in the future once again. And I think a recent example of our sister Anjanette Young, where she tried to get the body cam footage of her house being raided, took more than a year, even after policy was changed to allow for body cams to be released in 60 days. When we see reform fail, what is the next step? Structural change. And I think defund also can mean structural change in a lot of folks' minds as they are considering how to more effectively create a safe and thriving community that they live in.
I agree that in my mind, defund means structural change as well as reform. And I am a believer in reform as generally a trial and error method that works well over the long term, even though it's often painfully slow. But I don't agree with an abolitionist position, which I think ignores legitimate public safety concerns of the vast majority of the public and the realities of the situation. So to me, it means, yes, more intelligently looking at the jobs that we assign to police that we shouldn't assign to police, like dealing with mental health crises, like dealing with drug overdoses and drug problems, like dealing with homelessness. Those should not be things that the police are dealing with, and we should take that out of their sphere and put it in more appropriate spheres, and dealing with education discipline as well, I would put in that category. But that's my understanding of what defund means.
I'll just throw my 2 cents in there too. I think it's also, a lot of it is about ending our commitment and continued investment in mass incarceration and criminalization of Black and brown communities in particular. So the problem is when you look at who is being arrested for which crimes, and we know, for example, I do a lot of work in cannabis equity, and you see that the majority of people, for example, in New York that are arrested for cannabis possession, maybe like 90% of them, 80% are Black or Latinx. Even though usage rates are the same, we see that, the war on drugs is primarily about criminalizing Black and brown communities. It's not about drugs. It's not about, any of that. And so we have to stop investing in that and stopping investing in methods of social control and, the most harsh sort of responses to, social misery, and start investing in things that build people up, build communities, and address the root causes of social ill and social misery, because clearly just policing and mass incarceration doesn't work. And so that's another really important aspect of what defund is about. It's about investing in communities and investing in addressing the root causes of social misery.
Thank you to each and every one of you. I think Adam and David threw around the notion of structural change. And this next question is, again, open to each panelist. So as it relates to the rank and file officers, the contract that is currently in effect is being renegotiated. What are some things that you would like to see change within the new contract whenever that comes into effect, once it's negotiated? And why are these changes so critical?
So I can start this off because as a member of there's a coalition for police contracts accountability that consists of a group of reform organizations and community organizing organizations that's been together over the past several years and has come out with a list of 14 points specifically that we want changed in the current contract. 13 of those points come directly out of the task force report that was done in 2016. The 14th point that we've added is that we want officers who are frequent flyers in the discipline area to be penalized on their seniority, to somehow penalize them financially. And those, I should say, for those interested, those 14 points are listed on our website, which is www.cpcachicago.org.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things in there that I would like to see different, but as you mentioned one, but one in particular stands out to me is the requirement. I know there's other laws that also affirm this or back this up, but I would like to see the requirement that the city or any municipality be required to indemnify and cover police officers out of their own pockets for anything that they do in the course of employment. There should certainly, I think, be an exception for gross negligence, fraud, willful misconduct, things like that. And so, if a police officer does something that's just completely ridiculous and indefensible, the city taxpayer should not be, on the hook for covering his legal fees and whatever settlement the city pays and things like that. And they should be required to, carry, insurance, liability insurance, like a lot of other professionals have to do for the mistakes that they make at work, or anything that they willfully do that is wrong. So that's one thing that I think should be taken out. That doesn't totally fix the problem. I know we have to go to Springfield and change some laws there to make that real, but I think that would be a first good step.
Yes, I agree very specifically with all those points. I think they're great. One thing that I would like to see as a precondition of even the contract renegotiation is an actual visioning for what public safety looks like in the city of Chicago. Without that, we are negotiating terms without defining what service levels we are expecting to see from our police officers. And that should drive our negotiation and rewriting the contract itself and the degree with which we hire police officers and the staffing needs that we will have after that visioning has been done. And that should be a people-informed process. I mean, obviously, as a part of the people's budget, that's what I'm advocating for, but we definitely need to, as a community, understand all the needs of all of our communities and set our city on the course to fulfill those needs.
Yeah, and Calvin, I think this is a big question. The FOP contract is a long one, and I could probably go article by article saying what should be repealed or abolished. And like things, namely like the Police Bill of Rights. I think it's like Article 28 that like makes the FOP contract engagement with the public so difficult. Like it's written in the contract that it's a negotiation between the mayor and the FOP. Which really makes like organizing around this hard and makes demands for the contract really hard. But I'd also like to see us like turn our eye, and I think Akele brought this up, like towards Springfield in the General Assembly, especially with the Illinois Supreme Court ruling that, the FOP contract negotiations can't run afoul like what the General Assembly passes, like as it pertains to the criminal code or like labor relations code. And so I think one of the ways that we go about making demands of a very like closed off, behind closed door contract is we exercise our lobbying power and lean on our movement allies down in Springfield to really start, taking to task like the current criminal code and labor relations legislation.
I just want to say I would second that. I think that going through Springfield is probably going to be a more productive route than trying to do it through the contract renegotiation process for a variety of reasons. But among them are the fact that when we do get into disputes where the city is actually willing to push for some policy changes in the contract, those go ultimately to an arbitrator who's inclined to simply do what was done in past contracts, and that makes it very difficult to achieve reform solely through the contract renegotiation process.
Thank you. And Kennedy and Akele, and I think even David, you kind of touched on, kind of going to Springfield. and going the legislative route, which brings me to the next topic of discussion. With any real reform, right, there has to be a starting point. Particularly the Illinois Labor Relations Act governs these contracts. What are some aspects of the Labor Relations Act, the Illinois Labor Relations Act, which should be a central focus on any defund and or police union contract reform efforts?
Yeah, I think I'll start us. I think the section of the Illinois Public Labor Relations Act that talks about union negotiated collective bargaining agreements generally superseding any other local laws or statutes or ordinances and things like that when it comes to the wages, hours, and conditions of employment. And to the extent that protection is extended to police officers, I think that's something that needs to be teased out. And there's certainly either just an exception for police officers for various reasons or some sort of carve out so that that's not the de facto stance of when there is a certain conflict between a union agreement, a police union agreement, and then another law or ordinance or something like that. And I mean, I know, and we can get into the Illinois Supreme Court's recent decision regarding conflicts that arise between collective bargaining agreements and local law. It shouldn't just be that, when there's a local law that reflects, this dominant, well-defined public policy issue, that then it can supersede, collective bargaining agreements. I think that, law should be, sort of, the highest or the thing that supersedes any sort of contract agreements or provisions, especially when it comes to something like this. So, and local government should have the ability to regulate their police force as they need to. So those are some important changes that I think need to be made in Springfield before we can see a ton of progress locally.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That supremacy provision is a problem given the impediments that the police contracts impose on investigating and disciplining officers for when they act inappropriately.
Yes, I completely agree. I think the state's distribution of police power locally is a unique circumstance of any collective bargaining unit, and it needs to be dealt with appropriately. So 100% agree.
Are there particular aspects of these police union contracts that better serve not only CPD, but serves the community as well in a positive aspect?
Let me make sure I understand the question. Are you saying there's certain provisions in the contract, in the current contracts now that actually sort of empower local governments or help protect?
Empower local communities. There's certain aspects of the contracts that you would like to see remain that are positive within the particular contract.
I can't think of anything, but I haven't really reviewed them with with that in mind. So I don't know.
I second what Akele said. I also can't think of anything, but I bet my bottom dollar that there is nothing. So
I join those comments. I can't think of anything in the contracts that actually promotes community relations very effectively with the police department or serves the community's interests.
That's fair.
Yep.
That's fair. So the Chicago Police Department's budget is close to $2 billion. What are some areas that can be taken and redistributed to other parts of the budget outside of CPD that would better serve the community? I know we briefly touched on it, things like mental health counselors and things like that. Are there any other aspects within the budget that can be taken and redistributed, redispersed within a community?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this one. I definitely think each community has specific needs, and the People's Budget Project in particular asked folks what they would want to see in terms of public safety and thinking about the police budget. And it ranged everywhere from mental health clinics and first responding officers that had more sensitive training or a de-escalation protocols in place, to investing in community centers, giving youth things to do, figuring out different services that meet specific needs for each community, whether there is significant distrust with police because of immigration status. There are a lot of different things that each community feels it needs in order to become a more robust democracy and to be respected as residents. And listening to them, I think, is a good first step, and taking nothing off the table in ways to integrate all of our communities together as one city.
I think, Adam spoke to a lot of the investments in terms of like where to defund. I think one of the most obvious places, which is probably why we are even having this conversation around the contract, is less police officers and just getting less officers or more officers out of the department, which I think maybe Akele or Kennedy could speak more to of that specifically. The other thing I'm thinking about in terms of like defunding is the costs that are associated with police that we don't necessarily think about. So like surveillance, technology, equipment, capital costs of like maintaining buildings, and the various things that police use to like wreak havoc on communities, I think are other places that we should consider defunding.
Yeah, I mean, I think an easy one would be the litigation reserves. I would, tap that. That also, we need the other change too to make that make sense. So that the city's not on the hook for everything the cops do. But we should not be spending, I forgot the exact number over the past few years, but however many millions of dollars we spent defending officers in courts.
Yeah, it's about $100 million a year.
Yeah, to add one other thing that Kennedy brought up earlier, the police per capita in Chicago is the highest of any major city in the United States, excepting Washington, D.C., which has its own security needs that are unique. And so as most major cities are reducing their police force and Chicago continues to grow, we have to ask why. We have to ask what strategies are being funded and what alternatives are really more effective, instead of just defaulting to police presence as a tactic.
So there are two sides to the coin, right? One side wants to minimize any police reform efforts. The other side wants to push police reform. What are some of the pushback that efforts to defund has experienced and or seen that you guys may have noticed?
I mean, I think that we even heard it on the panel, right? Like there's this idea that when we're talking about defund, particularly through an abolitionist lens, but period, folks are concerned about public safety. And I think that maybe are missing kind of like the mark on the public safety considerations that are buttressing actually the defund demand. This is fully about public safety and keeping our communities safe. But I do think that a pushback here is like, what do we do with all of the X, Y, and Z's, right? And then we have to like really interrogate like how we're talking about defund, how we're talking about abolition. Again, this politic around presence and not absence, recognizing that we're humans, and humans not have a proclivity towards, but like humans hurt each other, and also like recognizing the root causes of the ways in which and the reasons in which we hurt one another, relying on that understanding of like the human element of all of this. Folks have trauma, this and that. And the point here is that the police don't address the root causes to that. I'm not sure if I was to name only the pushback or like respond to the pushback, but I think here it maybe just be like a fundamental miscommunication or misunderstanding, whether willful or not, that when we say defund the police, it is for the purposes of public safety and keeping our communities safe.
Perfect. So is there a way, within these contracts, if I have all the power, of course, I don't want to give up power, right? Is there a way to reach a middle ground between the sides so that efforts can continue to progress with that of least resistance?
So I just want to make a plug for the fact that there is an effort to explore sending alternative responders out in mental health crises and drug incidents and overdoses and homelessness. I think, well, I'm not sure it applies to homelessness, but the city council has a couple of trial programs going on to explore those. And I think those are a good first step in trying to test out some of these concepts.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't know if there's a ton of middle ground between the two sides. I feel like, the FOP sort of even represents the more extreme positioning of even officers in a lot of cases on these issues. So that is one issue that, just makes it really difficult to find middle ground. But, as David mentioned, I think one is that a lot of officers feel like they're required to do a lot of things that they don't even feel like is, in their job description. It's like responding to mental health crisis, things like that. The challenge there is still determining like when is something considered a mental health crisis versus, something just purely criminal. Is that even like a real distinction, but to the extent that, officers are doing a lot of different things, and sometimes that results in, harmful police interactions or deadly police interactions and things like that, where they shouldn't have been engaged in the first place. I think there may be some middle ground there. But, what that looks like in terms of a budget reduction for CPD, I don't know if there's an interest in exploring that avenue on their side. So.
So with that, we've talked about defund efforts. We talked about, budget cuts. So how might defund efforts impact women and minorities within the police department?
Akele, I'm going to pick on you because I feel like you've done really good research around this. And yeah.
Yeah. So there's been a lot of talk about this issue in the media and otherwise, and some are of the mindset that if you defund, the police or reduce their budget, then the first thing you have to do is, fire the most recent police officers to join the force, and that the most recent police officers to join the force are disproportionately, minorities or people of color, and that's kind of true. But then when you look into it, you think about what's the population that's most impacted by police violence. That's Black folks, that's Black communities by far. And the police force is not becoming more Black. So the younger officers are actually less Black than the older officers. And this goes off until, conversation about a lot of different things, but it is becoming, more Latinx, more Asian, but it's not becoming more Black. And so the communities that, ideally you want the most representation from are not, represented among younger police officers. And, this newer group of younger police officers don't necessarily hold more progressive views. That's an assumption that is made because they're younger and because, they're not white. I think a lot of folks assume that, well, they're going to have more progressive views. There's a Pew Research study, a recent one that was, done that showed that that wasn't necessarily the case, that many times these younger, quote unquote, diverse officers actually held the same views as white officers and older officers, especially when it came to the Black Lives Matter movement, to anti-Blackness, and to and issues of police violence. Many of them indicated they didn't see that there was a problem or a need for reform. And so I think we do have to sort of dispel or question this notion that, if we have a more diverse police force, whatever that means, or at least what it means right now for younger police officers, that doesn't mean that we're going to have safer, police interactions with the community. And it doesn't mean we're going to have necessarily more progressive views, especially on the most important issues like race, anti-Blackness, and how it helps us actually interact with the community.
So I agree with Akele that having a more diverse force does not necessarily in and of itself improve things, but I would say that it is likely to be a helpful step. And part of the problem, as I see it, is twofold, especially with respect to specifically Chicago. And that is, in the Chicago FOP union, retired FOP members remain voting members of the union, which acts as a further brake on improving attitudes among current members, because the loudest members tend to be the oldest ones who have the most objectionable views. And so whenever there are people who have more enlightened views, if they pop their heads up within the union structure, it tends to be cut off by the older, more retrograde members. So improving the diversity does help, I think, but I agree with you that in and of itself, it's not the total solution. But the other thing with the Chicago Police Department that I think is important is we have seen the Chicago Police Department slowly progressing from an organization that was really ruled by a patronage type process in terms of promotions. And we would like to see it move more towards a merit-based system where you've got actual training and supervision going on. That's not the result of some kind of political patronage system. That should also help improve the performance generally of the run-of-the-mill officer on the beat, in our view.
Yes, and I would add to that, officers of color and women officers also face unique pressures within their own constituency and their own organization. A lot of them are community leaders. A lot of them do seek to create neighborhoods that are safe and thriving. And so the needs that these officers face and feel also need to be respected in all of these conversations. And we need to listen to them, to hear from them what they need. This not only goes for Chicago, this goes for Cook County, state of Illinois, every police department. There has been some documented cases of white supremacist activity within police departments that needs to be unpacked. And so, if a Black officer seems to toe the FOP line, that can often be out of protection for their own safety. There are a lot of interpersonal and individual considerations for the police and any kind of reform efforts that need to be made with caution and with equity in mind, even for the police themselves.
Thank you. Thank you. So if I'm a local resident or someone who has heard of the movement or labeled Defund Police, what are some ways that I can get involved just starting from scratch?
Well, I can get started real quick. As someone working on the People's Budget Project in the second year, having these initial discussions about what it means to have a safe and thriving community is central. Learning from each other and what each member of your community needs to feel safe and to be informed as to some of the data that informs our decision making is a first step. Also reading the newspaper, following organizations that are advocating in this space, like the Chicago Lawyers Committee. We love the work that you all do. Just trying to keep that basic level of information going, and depending on your experience with the police, protecting yourself to a certain extent. I know right now with the Derek Chauvin trial, that's a very painful scenario for me personally. So I try to stay informed, but know when I need to step away so that I don't become disengaged, because this is heavy discussion for a lot of communities and will bring up some trauma. And so being kind to yourself while staying informed, I think is an initial and good goal.
I think another way to get involved is obviously joining the Defund CPD campaign and the organizations making up the campaign, or rather volunteering with the campaign that have a deep commitment to this work. But another piece that I think is just in the same breath of this thing I keep saying about this is about presence and not absence. I think the way that we get to that presence is by a radical exercising of our imagination. And so like I invite folks who are coming on to defund as a politic to think through like what this can mean for themselves and their community in terms of moving beyond survival into like thriving, well-fulfilled, life-affirming lives. Because I think that that's like a really important component of defund when we're talking about it. So there's like a great deal of self-work and, you know, that we can do as well. And I do appreciate Adam's comments about just like the overconsumption. I don't think that we have to consume trauma or watch folks get murdered by police to know that murder is bad and people deserve to live. So
I would second all that. I would also add on a very practical level, people talking to their aldermen and convincing their aldermen that reform is as important as public safety concerns, because that's often the way aldermen look at it on a reductive basis, and it's important to get that message through to your local representatives.
Yeah, I'm going to second that. Yeah, go definitely join advocacy organizations, organize, and then also go bug like the crap out of your reps locally, your state reps, like US, like all that. They need to hear more. So they need to hear this more often.
One thing to add, I think builds off of all the things that y'all have shared. I think it's really important that we are like talking to our family and friends, especially like, yeah, I think that is how we're gonna like build power for our movements. Like each of us individually can join the campaign, but if we're also like not moving our cousins and our uncles and our parents like on this, we just won't, you know, we won't ever have enough. So.
Thank you. Thank you again to all the panelists and for you participating today. I know we're coming up about 10 minutes left within the discussion. I wanted to take this time to kind of open up the floor, or you can type in the chat if you have any questions for our panelists here today.
Yes, I do. Thanks for your moderation panel, and thanks again to all of our panelists. I wanted to particularly present this question to the activists on the panel and really kind of draw the two connections of what we wanted to focus on with this panel, which is the FOP contracts and the movement to defund. If I understand it, there are a lot of hindrances to what anybody who is involved in the defund movement can do, given the language of the FOP contracts, that despite whatever proclamations and activist work is done, there are certain constraints that are always going to be implemented to the Chicago Police due to these police union contracts. And that's quite disheartening for anyone who is really trying to kind of focus on the locus of power and dismantling the unjust power that the Chicago PD has. So that being said, what are recommendations as to maybe A, keep the spirit alive, and then B, what true calls to action can be done? If we want to defund, all the defunding, litigation can be passed, but at the end of the day, the FOP contracts, have their constraints, and there is going to be a threshold as to, how much impact can be made. Or perhaps you'll tell me I'm wrong, Monica. There's not a threshold. There's, far more impact can be made than perhaps I'm aware of.
I'm not really an activist, but I'll try to respond. Yeah, a lot of this conversation today was about, the barriers and challenges that FOP contracts present to efforts to defund the police. And, I don't necessarily think that because the FOP contracts say one thing, I actually kind of think in a lot of ways they don't necessarily address the issue of
I think something too that I would like to see, not necessarily, not that this will happen this year, or maybe even next year, but like more reframing around the fact that like police are not workers. They shouldn't be in this like very protected union space. They don't operate in the same way as other unions do. And I think that like once we are able to move public perception away from police being protected in this way, we will, I think we will be able to also like, continue to just build on and make greater strides here too.
And I do want to add on to one thing that I said before. I do also kind of think that how, the city's ability to, create their own budgets and determine how their money is spent within their city may be like a well-defined and dominant public policy that, is enshrined in state law, or could be shown to be, enshrined in state law, and, should usurp or surpass whatever, some contracts say. So I don't know, I think there's just a lot more to the issue, but just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, I agree. It's a multi-pronged effort to address a lot of these concerns. And I think, the mayor's budget survey indicated that 87% of residents that responded wanted some significant police reform, and it still went nowhere. So, the political process in elections also plays a role here. Thinking about how we pressure our older persons in the budget process plays a role here. We are determining the future of our city with our investments and with our policies. And so all hands on deck to get the results that communities are looking for.
Perfect. Are there any more questions? No, I see probably have time for one more. I see one in the chat that I can read off. Can you talk about how the recent legislation and any other reforms have affected the relevancy of the 14 points of reform?
So I can address that. Basically, 3 of the 14 points have been addressed through either the recent crime bill or the Illinois Supreme Court decision. One of those points had to do with the destruction of police discipline records. The Illinois Supreme Court held that was against public policy, which should pretty much resolve that issue. On the other one, there's a question about whether anonymous complaints alleging police misconduct should be filed and should have to be investigated, basically. And the recent legislation has basically prohibited prohibitions on anonymous complaints. So it basically opens the door to allowing anonymous complaints in future collective bargaining agreements, but it doesn't apply to past collective bargaining agreements. So it would apply to any new contract that the FOP entered into, but it doesn't apply to the current supervisor's contracts. However, the arbitrator in the supervisor's contracts held that there was a workaround that does essentially allow some limited form of anonymous complaints. That is currently being litigated with the supervisors unions filing suit against the city, claiming basically that the arbitrator exceeded his power on that issue. The other 11 points, basically, including the 3 or 4 most important, in my view, for being able to hold officers accountable and minimize their interference in investigations, have not been addressed.
we have any other questions? We have time for probably one more question to the panelists.
I'd love to know if Adam has a, you said that we're disproportionate in terms of our cost per capita. And I'm wondering, like, are we 5% off? Are we like, how far off are we compared to other big cities?
Well, yeah, I threw the actual numbers of our largest cities in the chat. But we're second to DC. We're about 3 officers less than New York, who is the second, I think the second highest. Philadelphia is also pretty close, but we are the top, and we also have the outcomes that we have. So the spending on police is not netting the results we're also seeking. So accountability and performance is also a part of this as well, and figuring out what strategies need to be pushed for a police force to be more effective and to address these underlying causes of crime that have plagued our city. And I think all of that needs to be in the same discussion instead of done separately in a contract renegotiation and then trying to figure everything else out afterward. It's just completely backwards, especially since it's 50% of the operating budget of the city of Chicago. We have no real standing to determine the future of our city when we do a budget that way.
And we are at the 3 o'clock hour. Again, I would like to thank each and every panelist here today for taking time to inform everyone about the defund effort, the police union contracts. This was a great help for me individually. I've learned a lot and just sitting back and listening, to you guys. So again, thank you. I thank everyone for joining us here today and taking part in this discussion. If there are no further questions from either the panelists or the audience. Okay. Again, thank everybody. Thank you guys for your time.